adolescence. Okay, so when we talk about pubescence, we're talking about those 2 years prior to the beginning of puberty, right? So this is around ages 10 and 12 to females, 12 and 14 for males. So this is a time period where they have a lot of growth spurts, right? And they start beginning to develop the secondary sex characteristics, right? So these are the features that are not essential for reproduction, whereas primary sex characteristics are the physical structures that you need for reproduction, okay? So the beginning of puberty is when females begin their first period, which is menarche, and when males have their first ejaculation, which is spermarche, okay? Now, when we're talking about the Tanner stages, this is just a timeline of around when certain physical changes are going to happen in a male or female, okay? So we've noticed that puberty tends to be happening at earlier ages, and we think it's because of better nutrition and better medicine, right? Better health overall allows us to stay on track in terms of development instead of it being delayed because of malnutrition or illness or things like that. Now, in Belsky's study of maturation, right, early bloomers versus late bloomers, they realized in the data that they were collecting, the trends, that girls who develop early and boys who develop late have a higher risk for social difficulties, emotional difficulties, psychological problems, because early girls tend to be a target, right, for ridicule, whereas late boys are, the small, skinny ones that are easier to pick on. Okay, so they tend to have a harder transition during puberty than boys who develop early and girls who develop late. Developing until you are about 25 years old. So during your adolescence, one of the last parts to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of planning, organization, regulating your emotions, personality development, and response inhibition. So this may be one of the reasons why adolescents tend to make dumber decisions and are more likely to take risks. This graph, being around your peers has a much higher influence on whether or not you're going to take risks as an adolescent. So it's not just the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, it is also peer influence, right? So adolescents are twice as likely, the blue bar, to take a risk, make risky decisions when they're around their friends versus young adults, right? They are more likely, but less so. And then regular adults in the green bar do not care what their friends think, right? They are less influenced by peer decisions. Stages are mostly focused on that idea that we are trying to find out who it is that we are and develop our personality throughout our lifespan, right? So we're answering the questions, who am I? Where am I going in life? Throughout our crises. So James Marcia created 4 identity statuses for when you are going through these crises, right? So whether or not you have a crisis and then whether or not you have a commitment to a role is going to create these 4 statuses. So the foreclosure status is when someone doesn't have a crisis, right? They just commit to a role that was given to them by their family, by their parents, or by society, okay? Moratorium is when they are stuck in the crisis stage, right? So they're still struggling to figure out what it is that they want, so they experiment with different roles without committing to anything. Identity diffusion occurs when there is no crisis, but there's also no commitment, right? So this person doesn't feel any push or drive to try to figure out what it is that they want and commit to a role. Identity achievement is when there's a crisis, so the person is struggling trying to figure out what they want, but then they commit to a role and continue with that role. So they have achieved their identity. You can see there is this matrix of sorts where you're able to read all the different identity statuses based on whether a crisis is present and absent and whether a commitment is present and absent. Done on people ages 12 until they were 24, right? They tracked them to see where they would fall in these different different statuses, right? Over time, would it change? Would it stay the same? So most of the people in the study started out with identity diffusion, where they weren't sure what they wanted, or foreclosure, right? Where they would just do whatever it was that their parents were doing. most of the people in the study, by the time they were 24, had identity achievement, right? They had gone through a period of struggling to find out what it is that they want, and then they picked and committed to a role. There was still many who had identity diffusion, right? They weren't sure what they wanted, weren't really trying to figure out what it was they wanted, no commitment. Some of them had moratorium, where they jumped around trying to figure out different things, no commitment yet. And less had foreclosure, where they did whatever it was that their parents did or wanted them to do. 25. That age range is now being classified as its own developmental stage, as things have changed in terms of culture and timelines for when people are reaching certain milestones, right? So our search for our identity has been extended into adulthood, as most people are waiting until getting married in their 20s, late 20s, and early 30s, right? And starting families later and later for multiple reasons, which we'll cover in a little bit. Okay, so this has now become a transitional period that didn't really exist, maybe 30 years ago. So in this period, right, this is a subjective feeling of transition, meaning that a person in this age range may or may not feel like they are an adult, that they have achieved adulthood, right, depending on their situation, right? It's seen as an age of possibilities, right? How optimistic they are on all the different things that they could do with their lives. Where can they go from here? It's self-focused because they don't have any commitments, right? They don't have a partner necessarily that they're married to, or the kids that they have to take care of. So they're able to explore new opportunities and continue to form their identity, right? They're not a complete version of themselves. This has kind of become an extension of adolescence in terms of identity finding. Periods of transition, but they focus more on those who get married and have children. Those who do not do those things have less periods of transition because they have less periods of change in their life, right? So Erickson divided the adulthood into three main stages: intimacy, where you're trying to make relationships; generativity, where you're trying to make sure that your life is fulfilling; and integrity, where you look back on your life and decide whether it was worth it or not, if you have any regrets. So a midlife crisis would happen most likely during the generativity stage, right? That's the stage at which Erickson proposed we look at our jobs, look at our family, and we have to decide whether or not we feel fulfilled by those things. If you don't feel fulfilled, then you try to find fulfillment in something else, right? A new car, right? Buying another house, right? Spending money on material things to try to fill that void. Now, if you get married, that itself is a period of transition, right? Where you go from possibly living by yourself or with friends to living with this person that you're going to supposedly stay with the rest of your life, right? So this transition is made easier of living together when the couple has clear expectations on what it is that they want out of their relationship and how they're going to deal with things like housework, right? And bill paying and things like that. When there's clear communication about how these things will be taken care of, there's much higher marital satisfaction versus when this conversation is not had, right? It's kind of left to be figured out as they go. There tends to be lower marriage satisfaction as there's more arguments and disagreements, right? Where the expectations may not line up, but they didn't know that because they didn't have that conversation, right? Now, when starting a family, there tends to also be a dip in marital satisfaction. It tends to lower once they have their first child, but then it goes up once all their children have moved out of the house. Now, this is not to say that children make you unhappy. It's that children bring their own set of problems and complications, right? Children can be very fulfilling, but it's a whole nother person that you have to worry about and take care of, right? So that first child is a huge transition period because you are going from just trying to keep yourself alive and to trying to keep another baby, helpless human life alive, right? So again, the way that a couple deals with that transition, either working together and communicating clearly or not, is going to indicate their level of marriage satisfaction, okay? Same thing with parenthood. So the adjustment into parenthood is a lot easier when the expectations are lowered. What they mean by this is that parents have to understand that they are going to make mistakes and that their children are not perfect and they will also make mistakes, right? So when you have realistic expectations, the transition into parenthood and the relationship between parents and children is much better, much healthier, much happier. Now, for the empty nest syndrome, right, it's much easier when parents have roles outside of being a parent, when they either have jobs or hobbies or they volunteer in certain groups, right? If they have other activities that they do outside of just raising their children, they have a much easier transition from, full nest, having kids live with you, to empty nest, it just being you and your partner again. Okay, whereas those parents who have only ever raised their children, have done nothing else outside of raising their children, have a much harder time transitioning because now they don't know what to do with themselves. And that can be very scary and anxiety inducing. Page 460, the median age of when people are getting married is getting much later compared from the 1950s to 2005, right? And so there's a lot of reasons for this. One, money. It is much more expensive today than it was back in 1950, right? Wages have not increased, but cost of living has increased. So what you could get for a specific amount of money in 1950 is in no way comparable to what you could get today. You get much less today. So couples are having to wait longer and longer to save up enough money to settle down, start a family, buy a house, and do all those things. Careers are also important because in the 1950s, women didn't really have any viable career options, whereas today, with the women's rights movement, right, and all that stuff, we are now able to pursue our careers, right? And that is now more of a focus for women, that they want to make sure that their career is established before they start to have kids, because since they're the ones getting pregnant and giving birth, they're the ones that have to step away from their careers for the most part when they have children, right? So they want to make sure that their personal future is on track before they can settle down and have a family. And then culture shift. It is now more acceptable and more normalized to get married later on in life, not right when you get out of college, right? So that has also shifted the age to be at a later point. 160 compares the housework duties, between married men and married women. So as you can see, not too much has changed, right? Married men still do very little of the housework, whereas married women do a lot more, but it is on an upward trend for men. Men are more and more now taking on housework duties and sharing the housework duties with women versus women being the full, taking on the brunt of the housework and doing it all themselves. However, women are still doing the majority of it as compared to married men. Tends to follow very similar trends, right? So we all proceed through generally these stages, right? You have the exploration stage where you're trying to figure out what it is that you want to do, the establishment stage where you pick a job and stick with it, through maintenance, right? So most of us tend to stay in the same field that we start out in throughout our whole lives. And then decline is just as you get older, you work less and less, and eventually, hopefully, you retire, right? Now, physically, we change as we age. So in our appearance, we get gray hairs, wrinkles, right? We have neuron loss in the brain because we stop producing as many brain cells, and this can also lead to sensory loss. So you need glasses in order to read, hearing aids to hear, and then there's hormonal changes, more so for women than for men. So men do have a slight decrease in their hormone levels because remember, men are always at a constant hormone level, whereas women go through these cycles in their menstrual cycle of different levels of hormones every month. Now, once a woman reaches menopause, this cycle stops. So she is no longer on this regular cycle of hormones. So during this transition period, women have different symptoms, right? A lot of them, the most common being temperature regulation, right? So they're very, very cold and then they're very, very hot, and it's usually not congruent with the actual temperature of the environment that they're in. And they're also at a higher risk for depression, again, because of these fluctuating hormone levels, okay? Now, cognitively, our mental ability is relatively stable even through old age. So we have two types of intelligence, crystallized and fluid. So crystallized intelligence has to do with all of the facts and skills that we have learned throughout our entire life. For the most part, we don't really lose a lot of our crystallized intelligence. We can actually increase our crystallized intelligence as you can continue learning throughout your entire life. Fluid intelligence has to do with analytics and problem solving and like puzzle solving, things like that. So this is more likely to decline in the sense that it slows down. We're not as quick to solve puzzles and analyze and things like that as we get older. So we can still do it, but we're just slower as compared to when we are younger. Now, for memory, it's you use it or you lose it with anything in our lives, right? So the more mentally active and stimulated a person is, the less likely that they're going to have memory loss, or the less memory loss that they're going to have. Because the more you fire those neurons and keep your brain active, the more you use it, the more likely it's going to continue being a strong connection. Now, response time also slows down, both physically and mentally, right? So this ties into the fluid intelligence, right? So we are still able to perform the same tasks and do the same skills, just at a slower pace. Cognitively, right, women tend to do better in verbal skills, whereas men tend to be better with visual spatial abilities. This is really the only areas in which there are differences between men and women. In other academic levels and other intelligence areas, we're pretty much the same, right, in terms as when you compare, right, the same level of academic opportunity and things like that. Socially and personality-wise, women tend to be scored as friendlier, they tend to be more empathetic, they tend to be more neurotic. So we tend to pay more attention to nonverbal cues. So women tend to be better at reading body language and remembering what we call interpersonal details, right? So those random details about people. Whereas men tend to be ranked as more physically aggressive, sexually active, and competitive. So these are things that are based on societal gender norms and what society sees as appropriate behaviors for each gender, which we're going to talk a little bit more on the next slides. Now, they've tried to see if there are, but what are the reasons for the differences in behaviors for men and women outside of, what society deems as normal for men and women? So the first thing that they studied was brain hemispheres. So they thought that men only use the left side of their brain for verbal skills and the right side of their brain for nonverbal skills, and that there's no interaction. Whereas they thought women use both hemispheres of their brains for any task. Now, the research that they've done for this hasn't really proven it, right? You would expect in women for there to be a bigger corpus callosum, right? The thing that connects the two hemispheres, considering they supposedly have all this communication going between them, but that wasn't found to be true at all. And in the scans that they did where they looked at the activity in the hemispheres when both men and women were doing these types of tasks, they didn't really notice any difference in levels of, which sides of the brains were more or less active across genders. Now, for hormonal influences, they did realize that this does tend to have an effect on behaviors, right? So estrogens are the female hormones and androgens are the male hormones. And we all have both, just in different levels. So androgens are higher in males, estrogen higher in females. But what they've noticed in the studies that they were able to do was that babies who had higher androgen levels in the amniotic fluid, so in their in the sac in the womb, right, if they had higher androgen levels, they tended to have more what we consider male typical behaviors, whether that baby was a male or a female. So in this, we can see that hormones do play an influence, right? The different levels of hormones are going to influence this type of behavior. Norms is through socialization. Okay, so this is brought about through society and through child rearing. Okay, so this is how we get trained on what are appropriate behaviors for each sex. So we do this through operant conditioning and observational learning. So in operant conditioning, right, when we exhibit the correct quote-unquote behaviors for our gender, we are reinforced. We are rewarded, right, with praise or with actual rewards. And inappropriate behaviors are punished in the sense that they are disapproved of, right? Like when a little boy is crying, they'll tell him, oh, big boys don't cry, you have to be big and strong and brave, right? So they're unapproving of the crying, and when the crying stops, they'll praise them for crying, right? And that girls don't play rough, right? Girls have to be ladylike, so they reward ladylike behaviors and punish what they consider unladylike behaviors. Now, children also learn what appropriate behaviors are through observational learning. So they are more likely to model the behaviors of adults that are of the same sex. So from their parents, from teachers, television shows, movies, right? They identify themselves through self-socialization, right? They identify themselves as either boy or girl, and then they identify the people around them, and they look at the ones that are of the same sex, look at their behavior, and then start to adjust their own behavior to match that of the same sex adult. So in this way, they are surrounded by all these gender stereotypes. They learn them either at home, at school, through social media, right? So it's very pervasive in society that we have these strict gender norms, right? Even though it doesn't really make sense. Most of the behaviors for males and females can be seen in either.